You arrive just as the town gates creak open with the early groan of sunrise. The wood is swollen with damp and crusted with the grime of generations. It smells of iron hinges and old animal grease. You might have hoped for birdsong, or a moment of tranquil dawn peace. But instead, what you get is shouting. Lots of it. Shouting from somewhere behind the gates. Shouting from up ahead, where a vendor is already quarreling with someone about bread that is allegedly stale. And more shouting from a man trying to pull a pig back into his cart. The pig does not want to cooperate. It squeals loudly and adds its own opinion to the morning air. So begins your introduction to the medieval town. The gatekeeper doesn't say a word as you pass. He's leaning on a spear and scratching his beard, too tired or too bored to care who comes or goes. You are one of many faces he will see today. His eyes flick to your feet, taking in the mud already clinging to your boots. Welcome to the town. You haven't even taken 10 steps inside and you're already tracking in more filth. The street greets you with uneven cobbles, some missing entirely, others slick with something you hope is just water. But hope is dangerous here. You catch a whiff of something sour, something rotten, and something distinctly human. The stench is layered, like the town itself. At the bottom, ancient decay baked into the stones. On top of that, fresh horse manure from the baker's delivery cart. And on top of that, a perfume of cooking fat, sweat, animal fur, and the faintest scent of burning meat. Noise follows you like a second shadow. It's everywhere. Metal hammers clang from the forge. A bell rings, not to signal anything useful, but because some child decided to tug on the cord. A dog barks. Another dog barks back. A woman somewhere is laughing loudly while trying to keep chickens from escaping her yard. You pause, trying to take it all in, but the air itself seems thick with motion. There are people everywhere, doing everything, all at once. Children are running barefoot. A man is selling onions from a basket on his back, shouting the word, onions, as though it's the most exciting thing in the world. A pair of women are beating rugs from a second-story window. The dust flutters down, coating everything below in a fine gray veil. Someone sneezes. No one says, "Bless you." You sidestep a puddle, only to realize you've stepped into a worse one. The buildings are close, almost leaning into each other like conspirators. Timber frames groan with age. The upper stories hang over the street, casting shadows even in daylight. Laundry lines stretch across alleys like traps. If you're tall, you duck. If you forget, you'll wear someone's damp underclaws like a scarf. The town is tight, claustrophobic. Every wall is too close. Every corner smells of something you cannot name. There's no place to rest. Benches are rare, and if you do find one, it's probably wet, broken, or already occupied by someone who smells worse than the street. The town doesn't invite you to linger. It propels you forward. Past the butcher's, where meat hangs beside swarms of flies. Past the candle maker's shop, which smells like melted fat and smoke. Past a man selling eel pies with a grin that does not inspire trust. The sounds grow stranger as you walk. Someone is playing a lute poorly. You hear a rooster crow again, despite it being well past sunrise. And then, above it all, a bell begins to ring. Loud. Deep. Endless. It doesn't stop after 3 chimes. Or 7. It just keeps going. You're not sure what it means. Fire. Death. A wedding. No one seems to react, which tells you the noise is normal. Everything here is noise. By now, your boots are coated in muck. Your ears are overwhelmed. Your eyes don't know where to look. A cart rolls past, creaking on a bent wheel. The driver curses it loudly, then smacks the side with a stick. Something splashes from the cart. You hope it's just milk. A moment later, the smell tells you it is not. You reach what might be the town square, although there is nothing square about it. It's more of a bulge in the street where the market congregates. Tents and makeshift stalls lean in at odd angles. People shout over each other, each claiming to have the freshest fish, the softest wool, the strongest ale. A chicken escapes its cage and causes a brief, squawking panic. No one seems to notice that the panic tramples several turnips. The vendor picks them up anyway. Waste not. The church looms above all this, a solid block of gray stone. It looks eternal. The bells ring again, this time with more purpose. Someone mutters a prayer. Someone else spits. Faith is personal here. And loud. Even the holy part of the town doesn't offer peace. Just echoes. You try to imagine what it would be like to live here, day in and day out. You picture the smell stuck in your clothes. The noise in your ears at night. The constant stream of bodies, animals, carts, and voices. You imagine how long it would take before you stopped noticing it all. Before this chaos became your normal. Before the first impressions faded into routine. But you're not there yet. You're still noticing everything. The soot on the windows. The broken shingles. The dog eating something that might have once been bread. The sound of someone vomiting behind a tavern. The laughter that follows it. Welcome to the medieval town. Noisy. Filthy. Wide awake. And this was just your first few minutes. Let's talk about the smell. Because if you're going to understand a medieval town, you have to come to terms with the fact that it always smelled awful. Not occasionally. Not only when the wind changed or during the summer. It smelled bad all the time. And not just a single kind of bad. It was a cocktail of bad smells, layered like rotten onions, constantly shifting as you moved through the streets. And the people who lived there didn't even notice anymore. You might think the worst smell came from the people themselves, and you wouldn't be wrong. In an era with no daily showers, no deodorant, and very limited access to soap, humans were walking odor factories. And these weren't people lightly perspiring in clean linen. They were toiling, sweating, baking, hauling, and butchering in layers of coarse wool and leather that rarely saw a wash basin. Their sweat soaked into everything, into their clothes, their bedding, their walls. And as days passed, that smell ripened into something stronger, deeper, something that settled in and refused to leave. But the real champion of the town's stink was not the people. It was the waste. Human waste. Animal waste. Waste from tanners, butchers, brewers, and dyers. Waste from people throwing old food, bones, rags, and anything else they didn't want directly into the street. There was no garbage collection. No sanitation department. The street itself was the dump. Imagine waking up in a cramped wooden home above a shop. You rub your eyes, push open your shutters, and toss out last night's chamber pot. That's your morning routine. Now imagine every single person on the street doing the same. Not once, but daily. The results gathered in the gutters, mixed with rain, horse manure, and the occasional dead rat. The entire town was constantly steeped in this slow-moving slurry. There were regulations against it, of course. Medieval towns actually had laws, often repeated ones, prohibiting people from dumping refuse out their windows. But these laws were ignored. Because enforcing them meant confronting everyone. And no one wanted to enforce laws about dung, when they were ankle-deep in it themselves. Instead, people might shout a warning before tossing out their waste, guard is low, they'd cry in French towns, which meant, look out for the water. But the water in question was not fresh or clean or good. It was euphemism for urine and worse. And if you were too slow, you learned your lesson the wet way. Animals didn't help. Towns were full of them. Pigs rooting through the refuse. Chickens scratching and pecking. Dogs roaming freely, some half wild, others scrawny and diseased. And they too contributed to the overwhelming olfactory assault. In some places, pigs were even allowed to roam the streets on purpose to eat the garbage. It was cheaper than cleaning up. But the pigs left their own kind of mess behind, and they were not exactly tidy eaters. Then there were the trades. You might think a blacksmith shop smells of hot iron and sweat, and it does. But there are worse trades. Tanneries were the worst. They took animal hides and soaked them in urine and dung to soften the leather. Buckets of excrement were actually collected for this purpose. Some people even made money selling their own bodily waste. It was called pure in England, and it was anything but. The smell from a tannery clung to everything downwind. There were entire neighborhoods you avoided because your nose begged you to. The butchers, too, played their part. Blood flowed in the gutters. Organs were dumped behind stalls. Bones were left for dogs to gnaw or rot in the heat. There was no refrigeration, no concept of health inspection, no separation of fresh from foul. Spoilage was common. And yet people still bought the meat, because there were no better options. If the flies got to it first, well, just cook it longer. Or add more spices. Even bathhouses, where you'd hope to find some relief from the grime, had their own special stink. Water was reused, sometimes by dozens of bathers. Heat helped spread the aroma. People did not necessarily bathe to get clean, just warmer. And the soaps, made from lye and animal fats. So even washing yourself could leave a faint odor of burnt fat clinging to your skin. And what of public latrines? Some towns had them. They were often just holes in the ground, sometimes with wooden seats. But they filled quickly. And when they did, someone had to empty them. That someone was the gong farmer. Armed with a shovel, he would dig out cesspits at night. It was dangerous work with toxic fumes and the ever-present risk of falling in. But it paid well, because no one else wanted to do it. And yet, even the best gong farmers couldn't keep up with the waste. Overflow was common. And the smell spread through every alley and every floorboard crack. Sometimes, the rain would help, temporarily. A heavy storm could wash the filth from the streets. But it didn't clean anything. It just moved the filth somewhere else. Into the wells, perhaps. Or the lower parts of town, where it pooled and stewed. And then the sun came out. And it baked the wet rot into a steam that drifted back up into every window. It's easy to imagine a medieval town as charming, with cobblestone lanes and flower boxes. But the truth is that you'd smell it, before you ever saw it. From a hilltop, looking down, you might think the little town was picturesque. But the wind would change. And then you'd know the truth. You'd cover your nose. But the smell would still get in. It clung to your clothes, your tongue, your dreams. People were so used to it, they didn't notice. Newcomers gagged. Locals shrugged. It was just life. There was nothing poetic about it. No fragrance of history in the air. Just raw, rotting, living stench. The kind of smell that reminds you humans are animals. That towns are built from survival, not comfort. And that before plumbing, every step you took in a city was a gamble with your senses. This is the smell of the medieval world. A sour, oily, organic fog. It wafted from every doorway. It curled from every alley. It clung to every brick and every breath. It was the invisible weight pressing down on every life. And once it got into your nose, into your memory, you could never forget it. Even centuries later. If there was one thing you couldn't escape in a medieval town, other than the smell, it was the noise. It was constant. Relentless. A true and proper chorus of discomfort. There were no quiet mornings. No serene afternoons. No peaceful nights. A medieval town was always, somehow, in the middle of something. And that something was usually very loud. It started before dawn. Bakers were among the earliest to rise, and their work began with fire. The sound of bellows groaning to life, flames roaring in stone ovens, and bread paddles scraping against blackened bricks filled the pre-sunrise dark. Horses stomped and snorted in the stables as grooms shouted sleepy commands. Cartwheels creaked as deliveries rumbled down the alleys. You didn't need a rooster to know morning had arrived. The town woke up with 1,000 tiny collisions. Metal clanking. Wood snapping. Voices rising. By mid-morning, the noise had matured into something more assertive. Shopkeepers shouted prices. Vendors called out their wares in a sort of rhythmic chant. Ooh, onions, fresh onions, best in town. Hot pies, still warm, piping hot. wool by the bolt, thickest weave, strong as a saint's patience. It was a performance, each voice trying to rise above the others, like aggressive birdsong in a very grim forest. You couldn't simply buy something, you had to be shouted at first. Animals added their own verses to this daily opera. Pigs squealed as they were led by rope or, sometimes, simply wandered unattended. Chickens flat and clucked. Dogs barked. Cats yowled from alleyways. Horses, oxen, and donkeys made their displeasure known in brays, snorts, and the unmistakable hollow clatter of hooves on cobblestone. The town wasn't built to muffle these noises. It was built to amplify them. Sound bounced off stone and timber, ricocheted down tight alleys, and pooled in the marketplace. Work itself was noisy. A blacksmith's hammer rang out again and again. The sound echoed with a metallic purity that cut through everything else. Tanners shouted instructions across their stink-filled yards. Carpenters sawed and nailed. Weavers pumped treadles on large wooden looms that creaked with age. There was no such thing as a quiet job. Even the scribes, hunched over parchment, would mutter curses when ink spilled or when rats chewed their manuscripts overnight. And then there were the bells. Always the bells. Church bells marked the hours. But they also rang for births. For deaths. For fires. For feast days. For sermons. For warnings. For weddings. For anything, really. Sometimes, they rang just because someone pulled the rope out of boredom. The sound was heavy, solemn, and unmissable. It wasn't music. It was announcement. Reminder. Authority. It echoed for minutes after it stopped, like the town was still remembering what it had been told. Children contributed their own chaos. They ran through the streets, chasing dogs, each other, or nothing at all. They laughed, screamed, and fought. There were no quiet children in the medieval town. Just loud ones. Or invisible ones. Sometimes you'd hear a crash, an overturned bucket, a broken jug, and then a parent yelling. The yelling could go on for a while. Everyone else just kept going. Noise didn't stop anything. It was the background music of living. As the sun started its descent, the sounds didn't fade, they just changed. Taverns opened their shutters. Ale was poured. Music drifted into the streets, if you could call it that. It was often one man with a badly tuned lute and a slightly worse voice. Patrons shouted over him anyway. Laughter turned into arguments. Arguments sometimes became fights. You'd hear the scrape of a chair, the crash of a mug, a thud, maybe a groan, and then more laughter. And then it all started over again. The town never truly went to sleep. Night brought a new layer of sound. Stray animals rummaged through waste piles. Rats squeaked behind walls and under floors. Some streets fell into relative quiet, but only briefly. Somewhere, someone was always awake. A woman giving birth. A midwife calling for help. A thief knocking over a crate. A cat screaming on a rooftop. Bells tolling for a soul lost in the dark. And if you were lying on your straw mattress, trying to rest, you didn't just hear these sounds, you felt them. Through the thin walls, through the shared beams and rafters, through your pillow if you were lucky enough to have one. Sounds were intimate here. They weren't separate from you. They lived with you. You could close your eyes, but the noise still found you. It crept into your dreams. There was no insulation. No glass windows. Just shutters, open cracks, and the gaps between floorboards. Sound traveled freely, like smoke. You heard your neighbors cough. You heard their children crying. You heard their dinner boiling, their plates clattering, their arguments and their silences. It was impossible to live in isolation. The noise connected you. Whether you wanted it to or not. Festivals made everything worse. Or better, depending on how you measured it. Trumpets blared. Drums pounded. Crowds roared approval or disapproval, often with the same energy. Fireworks, primitive and smoky, might explode unexpectedly. Jugglers shouted. Clergy shouted louder. Every sense was battered at once. And yet, the people loved it. Because silence wasn't celebrated. Noise was life. And the medieval town was very much alive. It's easy now, in the modern world, to assume that the past was quiet. That without engines, radios, and factories, the world was somehow peaceful. But the truth is that a medieval town was perhaps even louder. Because its sounds were human. Unfiltered. Not behind doors or beneath layers of technology. Every sound came from a person, a beast, a bell, or a building in motion. It was organic. Uncontrolled. Exhausting. So if you find yourself transported to a medieval town, don't bother covering your ears. The noise will find you anyway. It will follow you into every alley, every shop, every room. It will become the rhythm of your day. The town speaks, always. Not in words, but in hammer strikes, hoofbeats, cries, and clatter. And it never, ever stops. You might have thought that a town, by its very definition, would have proper streets? A place to walk, to roll a cart, to lead a horse without the constant fear of falling into something unspeakable. But in a medieval town, the street was more of a suggestion than a fact. It was a channel between buildings. A winding trench of dirt and refuse, often narrow, uneven, and constantly changing depending on the weather, the season, or who had dumped what outside their door. Most streets weren't paved. Cobblestones were expensive, and even when they existed, they were often only laid down in front of important buildings or along heavily trafficked roads that led to the market square. Even then, they were badly laid, missing sections, and frequently stolen by enterprising locals, who found other uses for them. You could start your day on a flat surface, and end it twisted into a muddy ditch, your ankle bent and your dignity soaked in something questionable. The most notable feature of these streets, however, wasn't their uneveness. It was their filth. Everything ended up on the street. Not just human waste, which we've already met in all its horror, but the detritus of daily life, fish guts, straw soaked in blood, spoiled vegetables, broken crockery, greasy rags, the bodies of dead animals, and sometimes dead rats, if you were lucky. If you were unlucky, there were no rats visible because they were too busy, multiplying under the floorboards nearby. The middle of the street was often the lowest point. That was intentional, if you can believe it. Buildings leaned inward, and the road was designed to funnel everything down into the center, a crude drainage system in the loosest sense of the word. This central channel was known as the kennel, or gutter, and it flowed with all the slop and slime a town could offer. In theory, rainwater would carry waste away. In reality, it just moved the mess to someone else's doorstep. When it rained, the streets became rivers. Not pleasant babbling brooks, but brown, sluggish flows of slop and stink. Carts got stuck. Shoes were sucked off feet. And if you slipped, well, you didn't just get wet. You got ruined. You might have to throw out your clothes. If you could afford to. Most people just let them dry and hoped no one noticed the smell. In dry weather, the filth didn't go away. It just became crusty. It hardened into flakes that crunched underfoot. Dust rose with every step, filling lungs with tiny reminders of everything that had once been liquid. People coughed. Children wheezed. But the street remained a thoroughfare for all: goats, beggars, nobles in carriages, the occasional monk, and the ever-present chicken. No one expected to keep their feet clean. That wasn't the goal. The goal was to avoid the worst puddles. The black ones. The ones with a shimmer on the surface, and a smell that could knock the sense out of a mule. These mystery puddles were often avoided by locals with an instinctive sidestep, while travelers learned the hard way. And if it was dark outside, heaven help you. There were no streetlights. Only the moon, if it bothered to show. One wrong step, and you might not find your boot until spring. The sounds of the street were just as confusing as the footing. Sloshing. Squishing. The occasional squawk from a bird who stepped in the wrong place. Cartwheels made a distinct suction noise as they rolled through sludge. If you listened long enough, you could start to recognize the difference between a dry crunch and a wet slap. These weren't just sounds. They were warnings. You didn't travel without looking down. You kept your eyes on your feet, and one hand on your purse. Pickpockets loved crowded, narrow streets. They worked quickly, slipping through crowds like rats through rafters. If you were too busy, avoiding dung, they'd lift your coin. And the street, as always, would not help you. It did not care. It had no sympathy. Worse still, the streets were loud. Shouting. Animals. Bells. Music. Fights. A quiet street was either haunted, or on fire. Most of the time, the din was so thick you could barely hear yourself think. And if you weren't careful, you could get trampled by a horse, knocked by a barrel, or caught in the middle of an impromptu car accident. But still, people used the street like a communal room. They gossiped there. Children played there, sometimes with hoops, sometimes with sticks, sometimes with things they found that you don't want to think about too closely. Tradesmen worked there. Beggars slept there. Preachers gave sermons to crowds who responded more with jeers than prayers. It was everything all at once. When winter came, things didn't improve. Snow mixed with the filth and formed a gray, slushy soup that froze into treacherous patches. People fell. Cartwheels broke. Frost covered piles of waste, like icing on a particularly unfortunate cake. The town didn't stop moving. But it moved slower, grumbling and slipping through the frozen mess. In summer, the sun cooked everything. The streets dried, but not cleanly. They baked. The smell rose in waves. Flies swarmed. Rats got bold. And people carried handkerchiefs, not to look dainty, but to survive the scent. They dipped them in vinegar or herbs and held them to their faces. A small, desperate attempt to filter the air. And yet, despite it all, the streets were vital. They were the arteries of the town. Everything flowed through them: food, news, people, rumors, disease. You had to use them, whether you wanted to or not. There were no back roads. No secret clean passageways. If you wanted to get somewhere, you walked through the same muddy, stinking chaos as everyone else. In time, perhaps you'd stop noticing. The way locals did. The way they stepped around puddles without looking. The way they greeted each other over piles of manure. The way they laughed at travelers with wide eyes and clean boots. Because in the end, a street isn't just where you walk. It's where you live. And in a medieval town, that meant mud. And slop. And mystery liquids. And no better alternative. You might imagine that in a world without electricity, the darkness of night would bring peace. That once the sun slipped behind the rooftops, and the last flicker of daylight vanished, a medieval town would settle into silence. That it would become still, quiet, and sleepy. But this was not the case. In truth, a medieval town never really slept. It shifted. It changed mood. But it did not rest. The day belonged to merchants, traders, nobles, and workers. But the night had its own rulers. Its own voices. Its own strange life, that began when shutters closed and official business ended. The daylight crowds vanished, but they left behind their noise, like a drumbeat continuing after the parade had gone. In many towns, certain markets didn't even begin until the stars were out. Fishermen arrived with their slimy, slapping catches, eels, shellfish, and river trout still flapping weakly in baskets. Bakers worked through the night, and their apprentices were often seen running through darkened alleys with flour in their eyebrows, and soot on their faces, preparing for the next morning's hunger. If you wandered close to the ovens, you'd smell bread before you saw the light. Hot, dense, yeasty air escaping through wooden shutters. A rare comfort in a place not known for sweetness. Meanwhile, the taverns grew louder. Louder than they had any right to be after dark. They didn't close at sunset. They filled up. With laborers off duty, travelers arriving late, and locals looking for escape. Laughter crashed against walls. Songs, half remembered and off-key, echoed out into the streets. The clink of mugs, the creak of benches, the shouts of a losing gambler, all formed the soundtrack of post-sunset life. Then there were the arguments. You could hear them often. Behind thin wooden doors, out on steps, leaning from upper windows. A husband accusing a neighbor. A wife yelling at her husband for gambling away the bread money. A tenant shouting about rent. A dog barking in response. None of it hidden. There was no privacy in a medieval town, especially not at night. Every raised voice carried. Watchmen patrolled the streets, but not always effectively. Often, they were locals with little training and even less enthusiasm. Armed with lanterns and wooden staffs, they'd rattle their weapons or shout warnings to keep people indoors. But their main job was simply to walk and be seen. Sometimes, they shouted the hour. 2 o'clock and all is well. They lied more often than not. Because 2 o'clock was rarely well. There were no streetlights. Just flickering torches outside wealthier homes or lanterns swinging from doorposts. Shadows ruled the town. And in those shadows moved everyone you didn't want to meet. Thieves. Informants. Lovers sneaking to forbidden meetings. Smugglers moving contraband, salt cloth, or something more mysterious. The streets narrowed at night. Every alley seemed deeper. Every footstep behind you sounded louder. Every door that creaked open made you wonder what, or who, was stepping out. Midnight was not a time of peace. It was just a different kind of chaos. You might pass a cluster of people, huddled around a dice game by the light of a lantern. Or a woman singing to herself as she swept the filth from her doorway. Or a dog howling at a moon it didn't understand. Life kept happening. It didn't care about your need for rest. Even in homes, sleep was unreliable. Thin walls let in the noise of the street. Families slept crammed together, snoring, tossing, whispering. Infants cried. Rats skittered in the thatch above. Doors creaked. The fire hissed and sighed as it died. Sleep came in fits. Dreams were interrupted by church bells, watchmen's calls, distant arguments. The body rested, but the ears never could. And then there were the ghosts. Or so people believed. Strange sounds were always heard at night, wails, knocks, whispers that no one claimed. Some blamed spirits. Others blamed neighbors. It didn't really matter. Fear kept people awake. And the more tired they got, the more likely they were to hear things that might not have been there at all. Nighttime illnesses also had their own soundtrack. Coughs. Gurgling breaths. The soft moans of someone trying not to die before morning. Healers came in darkness with satchels of pungent herbs and grim expressions. The dying often whispered their final words to candlelight. And somewhere in the town, a clerk was woken up to write it all down in a ledger no one would read. So yes, the town never truly slept. It just traded one kind of noise for another. One kind of chaos for a different flavor. And in between it all, people lived. Staggering through the night. Humming songs. Boiling water. Bargaining under moonlight. Whispering secrets. Crying behind closed doors. All of it layered beneath a sky that didn't offer much comfort, only a pause before the next sunrise brought everything roaring back. When the sun finally set behind the crooked rooftops of a medieval town, darkness rolled in like a slow, suffocating tide. But even more unsettling than the night itself were the creatures it brought with it. In a time before screens and sprays and finely sealed windows, you didn't sleep alone. You shared your nights with a whole world of pests, tiny, twitching, biting things, that lived in your straw, your walls, and your food. You could close the shutters, bolt the door, even light a candle for comfort, but they would still come. They always came. Let's begin with the rats. Rats were not an occasional visitor. They were residents. Familiar, ever-present. They scurried across rafters and beneath beds, living just out of sight, but never out of earshot. The sound of tiny clawed feet scratching at wooden beams became a lullaby of sorts. A cruel lullaby. If you left even a crumb out, they'd find it. If you sealed your bread, they'd chew through the sack. If you laid down for sleep, they might gnaw at your shoes, or your hair, or anything soft. They lived in the walls, the thatch, the latrines, the alleyways, and sometimes in your bed. Some towns tried to fight them. Cats were kept around, not as pets, but as professional killers. But rats were clever. They found hiding places. They traveled at night. And most terrifying of all, they came in numbers. When one rat appeared, more were nearby, watching, waiting, breeding, and with the rats came fleas. Fleas that bit without warning. Fleas that lived in your blankets and your tunics and your hair. You could be clean, by medieval standards, and still be covered in bites. Itching was constant. Scratching became a habit, a nervous tic. Children scratched in their sleep, groaning and twisting in straw bedding that was itself likely full of fleas. Bedding was rarely cleaned. And if it was shaken out in the street, which did little to improve the problem. These weren't just irritants. They were deadly. Fleas carry disease. We now know that fleas spread plague, but in medieval times, people only knew that something invisible killed. One day your neighbor was healthy. The next, they had swollen black lumps and a terrible fever. The connection to the flea was unknown. But the scratching never stopped. Not in the dark. Not in the daylight. It was just part of being alive. Then came the lice. Lice lived on you. In your clothes, on your scalp, behind your ears. They weren't a sign of filth. Everyone had them. Rich and poor. Noble and beggar. People used lice combs, scraping carefully through their hair. They cracked the bodies of the lice between their fingernails. A sickening snap that became part of the morning routine. Sometimes they sang songs while doing it, to make it seem less grotesque. And there were bedbugs. They loved the seams of mattresses and the wooden joints of bed frames. You might not see them, but you would feel them. Little bites that appeared in clusters. Tiny trails of blood on the sheets. You could burn herbs to try to drive them away. You could scrub your bed frame with vinegar or ash. But they always came back. Because you never had just one. You had dozens. Maybe hundreds. All waiting for you to close your eyes. And of course, there were the mosquitoes. You might think they wouldn't be common in a town. But between stagnant wells, open sewers, and uncovered rain barrels, they had no shortage of breeding grounds. They buzzed through summer nights, hovering over sleeping faces. Their bite was swift, and the itch lingered. You could slap at them in the dark, but you'd rarely win. They were fast. And they always came back. The buzzing wasn't just a sound. It was a warning. One buzz meant one bite. Two buzzes meant you weren't sleeping tonight. Entire families would wake up scratching. Bleary-eyed, red-skinned, and frustrated. No one slept deeply in mosquito season. Not unless they passed out from sheer exhaustion. And then there were the creatures no one named. Things that bit in the night but weren't seen. People would wake with strange red marks. Swollen patches. Burning welts. No one knew what caused them. Was it a spider? A mite? A demon? Some thought it was punishment for sins. Others thought it was just the curse of town life. The price of walls and neighbors and all the comforts of being civilized. People developed strategies. They hung garlic. They burned rosemary. They lined their bed frames with ash or salt or even crushed chalk. They tucked dried lavender into their sleeves. They whispered prayers. They told stories of saints who never got bitten. But the truth remained. No one escaped. Everyone was bitten. Everyone itched. Everyone knew that something small and awful was coming for them after dark. The morning offered little relief. You woke sore and irritated. Covered in bites. Your sheets stained. Your body aching from the strange positions you curled into while trying to avoid invisible attackers. You scratched. You muttered. And you got dressed. Because the town didn't wait for your discomfort. It demanded you get back to work. Bites or no bites. Sleep was never restful. It was an uneasy truce with the dark. A few hours grabbed between itches and squeaks. A fragile break from the chaos of the street, punctuated by the crawl of insects and the gnaw of teeth in the walls. You slept knowing you'd pay for it in scratches. You slept because you had to, but never because it was peaceful. And so, in the still of night, if stillness could ever be used to describe a medieval town, you shared your space with 1,000 tiny roommates. Each with a purpose. Each with sharp little teeth or piercing little mouths. Each ready to remind you that in this world, even your sleep didn't belong entirely to you. Not when the rats ran across your beams. Not when the fleas nibbled your ankles. Not when the bedbugs stirred beneath your straw. They were always there, just waiting for the light to go out. Water is one of those things you don't think much about until you don't have it. Or worse, until you have it, but it's the wrong kind. In a medieval town, water was everywhere and yet somehow never clean. It flowed through the gutters. It collected in slimy puddles. It dripped from roofs and soaked into the ground. But drinkable water, the kind that wouldn't make your insides churn, was always a gamble. Most towns relied on wells. These were deep holes dug into the earth, and lined with stones, sometimes wood, depending on what the town could afford. At the top, there was usually a pulley, a rope, and a bucket, or what passed for one after years of use and rot. You lowered the bucket, heard the soft splash, and hoped that whatever came back up was clearer than soup. Sometimes it was. Often, it wasn't. Wells were communal, which meant the whole neighborhood shared the same source. Dozens of hands on the same rope? Dozens of mouths drinking from the same pail? People dipped dirty jars, crusted cups, even greasy cooking pots right into the water. They washed vegetables in it. Washed fish. Washed their hands, or what passed for washing in a time before soap was common. The well might have started clean, but it didn't stay that way. And then there were the accidents. Animals fell in. Sometimes a dog, sometimes a rat. Children dropped toys. Men dropped tools. Women dropped buckets. And no one stopped using the well afterward. What choice did they have? They shrugged, maybe murmured a prayer, and went right on drinking. Other sources of water included rivers or streams, if you were lucky enough to live near one that hadn't become the town sewer. Which most of them had. Towns often dumped waste into flowing water. Night soil, kitchen slop, dead animals, it all found its way downstream. And somewhere downstream, another town dipped its buckets in. It was an ecosystem of shared misery. In dry seasons, things got worse. Wells dried up. Buckets scraped the mud. People dug shallow holes in hope. Some walked long distances to find water. And when they did, they had to carry it back. Heavy. Sloshing. Spilling with every uneven step. Children were often tasked with this. Small backs bent under large wooden pails. It was exhausting, daily work. But absolutely necessary. And when water did make it home, it was never used freely. Every drop was precious. People reused cooking water, reused bath water, and sometimes even reused rinse water from laundry. Water wasn't wasted. It was cycled. From one dirty purpose to the next. Until it was more sludge than liquid. And even then, someone might still use it to mop the floor. Boiling helped when fuel was available. But fuel meant wood, or dung, or coal. And all of that cost money, or time to gather. So most people drank their water as it came. Cold. Muddy. Occasionally wriggling. If there were bits floating in it, you squinted and looked away. If it smelled strange, you held your breath and swallowed fast. It was better not to think too much. Illness followed the water, of course. Diarrhea was common. So common it was almost considered normal. Children died from it. Adults weakened by work couldn't fight off infection. Fevers came and went like bad weather. People talked about bad humors, or curses, but it was the water. It was always the water. And yet, water was still used for everything. Cooking. Brewing. Cleaning. Bathing, if you were lucky. Beer was safer, ironically, since boiling was part of the brewing process. Many people drank weak ale more often than water. Even children. Because ale didn't kill you. At least not immediately. Water might do it faster. But still, you needed it. Every morning began with water. Someone had to fetch it, carry it, store it, protect it from dust, bugs, rats, and neighbors. Water was life. Dirty, dangerous, essential life. Even the sound of it, sloshing in a bucket, dripping from a roof, was part of daily noise. Not peaceful like a stream, but ever present. And sometimes, in the dead of night, someone would wake thirsty, creep to the storage jar, sip in the dark, and wince. Because the water never tasted good. It just tasted like what you needed to survive. That was the reality. A town surrounded by liquid, but never comforted by it. Wells that could kill. Buckets that leaked. A constant fear of thirst, disease, and waste. And yet, people kept going. Day after day. Bucket after bucket. Because there was no other option. In the dim bustle of a medieval town, food was not just a necessity. It was a struggle. A compromise between what you needed, what you could afford, and what hadn't already gone bad. There were no refrigerators. No expiry labels. Just instincts passed down by word of mouth. Smell it. Taste a corner. Poke it with a stick. If it didn't move or bite back, maybe you could eat it. Markets were the center of food trade. Narrow streets opened into chaotic squares lined with stalls and carts. Sellers shouting over one another. Flies hovering in thick black clouds over fish and meat laid bare in the open sun. You didn't shop by preference, you shopped by timing. Get there early, and maybe the bread was still warm. Arrive too late, and you were left with bruised fruit, sour milk, and meat that had gone from red to brown. And then there was the bread. Bread was the lifeblood of the poor. Heavy, coarse, dense. Made from barley or rye, or whatever grain hadn't been eaten by weevils. It was often mixed with bits of chaff or powdered legumes to stretch it further. You could chew it for a long time. Sometimes too long. It wasn't unusual to find a stone, or a hard lump in your loaf. Bakers added anything that made the dough stick. Sometimes, even sand. Which meant your teeth might chip before the crust did. The wealthy had white bread. The kind made from refined flour, soft and fine. The kind peasants only saw when they worked in the kitchens of others. But most people had to settle for the kind of bread that grew mold by the second day and hardened by the third. You soaked it in broth, or ale, or anything wet. It didn't make it taste better. It just made it possible to chew. Meat was rarer, expensive, a luxury for festivals or Sundays. And even then, it wasn't fresh. Butchers didn't have ice. What they had was salt. So meat was preserved in thick layers of it, dried until it resembled leather. Rehydrated in pots, stewed with whatever vegetables could be found, and served without ceremony. Bones still in. Gristle still clinging. If you were lucky, the meat came from something recently dead. If not, it came from something suspiciously old. Or suspiciously stringy. Rats loved meat too. And they didn't wait for you to buy it. They gnawed at hanging carcasses, left tiny teeth marks in the fatty cuts, burrowed into sacks of grain, and sometimes were mistaken for food themselves. There were stories, half jokes, half warnings, about meat pies that meowed before they were baked. Street vendors sold hot food from carts, and no one asked too many questions. Because hunger dulled suspicion. And curiosity could spoil your appetite. Vegetables were seasonal. You ate what grew. Root vegetables, onions, cabbage, leeks. There was no such thing as a year-round tomato. And most meals tasted the same, because they were. A stew called pottage, bubbling in a pot over a smoky fire. Refilled daily. Old ingredients never truly removed. Just new ones added. Like a living soup. with layers of taste and bacteria. If food began to rot, that didn't mean it was thrown away. It meant it was spiced more heavily, or cooked longer, or fed to someone lower on the social ladder. Rotten eggs might be used in baking if they were just a little off. Sour milk became cheese. Moldy bread was trimmed, not tossed. Nothing wasted. Everything stretched. Food was often shared. Not out of generosity, but survival. Families pooled ingredients. Neighbors bartered leftovers. Even strangers shared meals in taverns, eating from the same bowl. Double dipping wasn't frowned upon, it was expected. Because cutlery was rare. Fingers did the work. And no one had the energy to be picky. Children grew up licking bowls clean. Not because they were told to, but because there might not be another meal for a while. Food shortages happened often. A bad harvest. A shipment delayed. A lord raising taxes and taking grain as payment. Suddenly, the market stalls were half empty. Bread was half-sized. And stew was mostly broth. Winter was hardest. Supplies ran low. Rats multiplied. Roots shriveled. And people grew pale from hunger. Spring meant hope. But it also meant the last of the salted meat. Tough. Gray. Almost inedible. But eaten anyway. Food wasn't about flavor. It was about calories. Energy to lift, to walk, to live one more day. Spices, when available, were used to cover decay. Herbs were added not for taste, but because they were rumored to stop bad airs. Every bite was both sustenance and risk. You ate to survive. But some meals might kill you anyway. And always, the rats watched. Waiting for scraps. For crumbs. For a moment of distraction. They lived in your pantry. In your thatch. Under your floorboards. Sharing your hunger. Thriving in your desperation. A medieval town was never quiet. Not truly. Even in the dead of night, when candles were blown out and shutters were closed, the town whispered and grumbled. It moaned. It creaked. It sang its strange, clanging lullaby. For those who lived there, silence was something you remembered, not something you experienced. The first and most familiar noise was the bell. Church bells rang regularly, slicing through the air like iron against bone. They marked the hours, called the faithful to prayer, and announced births, deaths, marriages, and fires. When they tolled in the middle of the night, people froze in bed. Bells didn't ring for nothing. Something was happening. And it was rarely good. Then came the clatter of carts. Wooden wheels grinding against cobblestones. Axles creaking under sacks of grain or bundles of firewood. The sharp yell of a driver urging tired oxen forward. The jangle of harness buckles. Even at dawn, these sounds began early, echoing off stone and timber. A reminder that labor never slept. That the day had to begin whether your body was ready or not. Hammers joined in next. Blacksmiths worked with rhythm and force. Ping, ping, ping. Iron bent into shape. Sparks flew. Anvils rang like iron bells of their own. You could hear the same hammer beat all day. And all night, if the smith was pressed for time. The noise became part of your bones. You didn't notice it until it stopped. Street vendors shouted their wares. Not with quiet persuasion, but with theatrical force. Hot pies, fresh fish, bread for a penny. Their voices competed like crows fighting over scraps. They barked offers, told jokes, sang songs. Noise was their advertisement. In a world without billboards or megaphones, your lungs did the work. All day, this chorus drifted through the alleys, layered with the clink of coins and the splash of water dumped from upper windows. Children added their own sounds. Laughing, crying, arguing over scraps, playing with carved sticks or rolling hoops. Sometimes, wailing from hunger or pain. Babies cried without end. Toddlers screamed when pulled away from danger, horses, fires, strangers. Childhood was loud. Not precious. just present, like a background hum of grief and potential. Animals were everywhere, and they never shut up. Chickens clucked underfoot. Dogs barked at shadows. Pigs grunted as they rooted through trash. Goats bleated on stairwells. Roosters crowed at hours that made no sense. Horses clopped along with carts. Oxen groaned under their loads. All of them part of the same chaotic orchestra. You could not go a single hour without some beast demanding to be heard. And then there were the human cries. Some sudden, some slow. A thief caught in the act screamed as he was dragged through the street. A mother wailed as her child burned with fever. A drunk shouted nonsense at a wall. A man sobbed softly behind a latrine. Voices carried. Pain carried. And when the town went darker, those voices grew louder. Taverns exploded with noise each night. Music played, if it could be called that. Crude instruments. Clapping. Foot stomping. Songs shouted more than sung. Tankards slammed on tables. Dice rattled. Fights broke out, then ended in laughter, or more fists. Walls thudded. Benches scraped. The whole building groaned under the weight of merriment and menace. And the sound spilled into the streets. Night brought the cries of the sick. The coughs that wouldn't stop. The groans from open windows. The muttering of those fevered and fading. Death was not quiet. It arrived on a wheeze. On a whimper. On the clatter of a stretcher or the tolling of a bell at 3 a.m. Someone always died in the dark. And someone always heard it happen. In the alleys, fights erupted. Arguments shouted through closed shutters. Lovers' quarrels. Debts disputed. Slaps and screams. Watchmen's boots stomped by in haste. A stick striking a door. A whistle. A shout of, "Stop him." Then more silence. Followed by muttering. Followed again by someone singing to themselves in the distance. The town breathed. In gasps. In yells. In shrieks and whispers. Even the walls had their sound. Wood settling. Insects chewing. Water dripping. Roofs groaning in wind. Chimneys whistling. Homes were not silent boxes. They were musical instruments of survival and wear. And you, lying in your straw bed, heard it all. Through thin walls. Through the cracks and shutters. Through the floor. Through your skull. The town filled your ears. It filled your dreams. It never let go. You learned to live with the noise the same way you lived with the cold. By pretending it wasn't there. But it always was. A medieval town never slept. And neither did its voice. It rang, clanged, chattered, wept, laughed, screamed. And you, weary as you were, just pulled the blanket over your head and listened. Because that was life. Loud. Relentless. Human. Waste in a medieval town was not just a problem. It was the problem. You could see it. Smell it. Hear it spluttering from windows. It crept between the cobblestones. It piled in corners. It flowed, if it was wet enough. It dried, if it wasn't. Either way, it was everywhere. Because in towns made for survival, disposal was something people talked about only when it was already too late. There were no underground sewage systems for most medieval towns. Not for the poor, anyway. No neat pipes. No flushing mechanisms. Just buckets, ditches, and gravity. Waste, human or otherwise, had one destination, the street. And it got there the simplest way possible. Out the window. Sometimes through a chute. Sometimes by hand. Often without warning. If you were unlucky, you walked beneath a chamber pot just as it was emptied. It happened often. The cry of, "Gardaloo," might be yelled first, if the resident was courteous. It meant, in effect, look out below. But not everyone warned. So people hurried through narrow alleys with heads down and shoulders hunched, praying not to be baptized in someone else's filth. Even when it didn't fall on you, it was still underfoot. The streets became rivers of refuse after rain. Not just human waste, but animal dung, rotting food, butcher scraps, broken pottery, dead rats. It was a stew of civilization. And it was thick. Sometimes ankle deep. Sometimes worse. Sidewalks, if they existed, were raised for a reason. They were sanctuaries. Elevated islands above the slop. But most people walked in the muck. Carts rolled through it, spraying filth left and right. Shoes were coated, rotted, ruined. Sandals gave no protection. Boots helped, but only barely. You didn't really walk, you waded through layers of what others had left behind. Waste collectors existed in some towns. Men with carts, sometimes called gong farmers or nightmen. They came after dark, scooping out privies, dumping the contents far outside the town walls. It was hard work. Filthy. Dangerous. Paid poorly, but better than nothing. And it was necessary. Without them, the town would drown in its own leavings. And sometimes, it nearly did. But most waste wasn't managed. It was ignored. Pushed to the corners. Left to rot. Forgotten until the smell became unbearable. Or until disease reminded everyone why it mattered. Outbreaks came with the heat. Flies multiplied. Rats feasted. Children played next to puddles that should have been avoided. But when filth is everywhere, you stop seeing it. Waste seeped into wells. Mixed with runoff. Contaminated everything. Even the air. People believed in bad air, miasma. They thought smells carried disease. And in a way, they weren't wrong. Stagnant pools of waste attracted flies, spread bacteria, fostered plague. The town became its own incubator. A laboratory of infection. And no one was immune. In wealthier homes, privies were built inside. But even those just emptied into cesspits below. Holes that filled. Overflowed. Leaked. Sometimes the pits collapsed, swallowing walls or floors. Imagine eating dinner above a growing pool of human waste. You don't need to imagine. That was the reality. Public latrines existed in some places. Wooden benches with holes. A trough below. Sometimes shared by dozens. With no privacy. And no maintenance. You went in. You did your business. You left quickly. And you tried not to breathe through your nose. But even holding your breath didn't help. The smell clung. To your clothes. To your skin. To your thoughts. Some tried to fight it. Sprinkling herbs. Burning incense. Scattering straw over waste. But it was never enough. Filth won every time. It came back faster than you could cover it. And people stopped trying. Because effort costs energy. And most people didn't have energy to spare. Waste shaped the way people lived. It dictated which streets you walked on. Which corners you avoided. Which houses you didn't rent. It settled arguments. It sparked complaints. It was the unwanted guest that never left. And somehow, everyone tolerated it. Because there was no other way. The smell of a medieval town wasn't a single scent. It was layers. A tapestry. Rotting cabbage. Human sweat. Horse dung. Piss-soaked alleyways. Smoked meat. Wet leather. Dead rats. Boiled soap. Stew. All of it, all at once. All of it pressing in on your nose. Making your stomach tighten. Making you numb. Until you didn't smell it anymore. That was the trick. You stopped noticing. Because the alternative was madness. Or despair. Waste was everywhere. So it became nothing. Just part of the town. Like stone. Or rain. Or God. It was there when you were born. It was there when you died. And in between, it was just something you walked through. Night in a medieval town came slowly, like a heavy curtain pulled across a stage. It didn't just fall, it crept. Shadows lengthened, fires were stoked, shutters were closed. But even as light vanished from the sky, the world below never truly darkened. Not entirely. Because fire, tamed, flickering, unpredictable, was always there. And with fire came light, and danger, and fear. In towns built mostly of timber and thatch, fire was both a necessity and a curse. Every home had one. A hearth that never fully went out. Coals were banked under ash each night, kept alive to be rekindled in the morning. Families cooked over it, warmed their hands by it, dried wet clothes near it. It was the heart of the house. But it was also the ever-waiting spark of destruction. One overturned pot. One gust through a cracked window. One careless ember landing in straw. That was all it took. Flames caught quickly. Spread upward. Outward. Roof to roof. House to house. Alley to alley. Entire neighborhoods could vanish in an hour. And there were no fire departments. No trained teams with hoses and ladders. Just neighbors with buckets. Buckets made of wood. Often leaking. Filled at wells that might be dry or far away. People formed lines, bucket brigades. Passing water hand to hand. Throwing it at flames that laughed back. And always, someone was trapped. Inside. Screaming. A child. An elder. Someone who had been sleeping and woke too late. You heard it happen. From the street. The shouting. The collapse. The silence afterward. Every town had a memory of fire. A year. A street. A name. People whispered about it when winds blew too strong or when a candle burned too close to the drapes. It was a fear etched into the stones. Passed from mother to daughter, father to son. Don't leave the fire unattended. Don't fall asleep with the hearth still roaring. Don't let the flame touch the roof. But at night fire was the only light. Torches. Lanterns. Oil lamps, if you were lucky. A flickering glow from window to window. From door to door. The streets shimmered in gold and shadow. Dancing light that made the alleyways seem alive. Every shadow looked like a figure. Every gust threatened to snuff out the flame. Or feed it. Watchmen patrolled the town with torches in hand. They weren't always sober. Or vigilant. But their footsteps and light gave some comfort. You might hear them knocking on doors. Shouting curfew warnings. Or ripping their staves on the stone to signal the hour. Yet, even they were afraid of fire. If it started, there was little they could do. Except yell louder. Ring bells. Bang on doors. Inside homes, candles burned low. Wicks sputtered. Wax dripped onto wooden tables. The fire in the hearth hissed and shifted. It was a companion. A living thing. You tended to it like a pet. Or a god. You kept it from growing too big. Or dying out. It demanded your attention. Your caution. Your respect. Even the smoke from cooking could spark fear. If someone saw it where it shouldn't be. Pouring from a neighbor's roof. Creeping along the rafters. People panicked fast. They had to. A fire not caught immediately was a fire that could not be caught at all. And so, many lay awake at night. Not from the noise. Not from the filth. But from the worry. What if tonight was the night? What if that crackling sound wasn't the hearth, but the roof above you? What if the orange flicker on the ceiling wasn't candlelight, but something climbing, spreading, feeding? Some prayed. Others simply stared at the rafters. Listening. Watching the play of light against the wall. Fire could warm you. It could comfort you. But it could also take everything. And you would never hear it ask permission. That was the flickering terror of medieval towns. A single spark could end a street. A city. A life. It didn't need wind. It didn't need fuel. It just needed one mistake. And there were always mistakes. So the night never brought true rest. Only the illusion of it. Beneath your blanket, under your thatched roof, with a fire crackling a few feet away, you waited. You hoped. You slept with one eye on the glow. One ear on the wind. Because even in sleep, the medieval town breathed fire. Midnight did not mean rest in a medieval town. Not for everyone. The sun might have vanished, Candles blown out, hearths dimmed to coals, but the town itself was never truly asleep. Beneath the stillness, things stirred. People moved. Lives unfolded in shadow. Work continued, unnoticed. Silent. Or not so silent. The poor often worked when others slept. Some by choice. Most by necessity. Bakers rose well before dawn. Their ovens had to be hot long before the market bell rang. They kneaded in darkness, lit by flickering lanterns. With calloused hands and aching backs. The thud of dough. The crackle of fire. The soft curse when a loaf burned. This was the baker's midnight chorus. Nightmen worked the latrines while the town lay in uneasy sleep. Their carts rolled through alleys, collecting what others left behind. Gong farmers, as they were sometimes called, lowered themselves into pits of human waste. With buckets, ropes, and bravery that no one envied. The town pretended not to see them. Pretended not to hear the sloshing barrels, or the hollow echo of wooden wheels. But they were there. Always. The town crier, too, walked through the night. Especially during times of danger. His bell rang through empty streets. His voice echoed against closed shutters. Stay indoors. Keep your fires low. A thief is at large. The plague has claimed another. His announcements were brief. Distant. Ominous. He was not a friend. He was a warning. And then there were the midwives. Called out at all hours. Roused from beds to guide new life into the world. In the dim light of a single candle. With whispers. With calm hands. They moved silently through the town. Cloaks pulled tight. Faces grim. They were keepers of secrets. And not all births were wanted. Not all babies survived. Some cries were soft. Others never came. The watchmen, those night guardians, roamed the same routes every hour. They carried torches or lanterns. Clubs at their sides. Calling the time. Checking for fire. Looking for crime. Or pretending to. Sometimes they dozed against doorways. Or traded ale behind stables. But even lazy eyes saw something. And even careless steps left a sound. Footsteps. Repeated. Familiar. Thieves came out under cover of night. Silent fingers pried open latches. Lifted coins. Stole bread. Not always from greed. Often from hunger. Rats in human shape. Crawling through shadow. Taking what daylight denied them. Sometimes they were caught. Dragged through the streets. Beaten. Chained. But usually, they disappeared again. Into silence. Cats prowled. Dogs barked. Horses shifted in their stalls. Night was not empty. It was filled with soft motion. With murmurs. With sounds that teased the edges of sleep. The creak of a sign in the wind. The sudden flutter of birds disturbed by an unseen shape. The town also held souls that didn't sleep. The wandering. The haunted. The mad. A woman mumbling to herself beneath an arch. A man sitting motionless at a crossroads. No home. No destination. Only the dark to keep them company. And sometimes a prayer. Superstitions thrived in these hours. Ghosts were said to walk between midnight and dawn. Spirits of the unburied. The wrongly executed. The abandoned. People whispered about them. Kept charms by their beds. Drew crosses on their doors. Children were told never to follow voices at night. Never to answer footsteps that had no source. The town held its breath when the wind howled. Or when the silence grew too complete. In some windows, candle light still burned. A sick child being watched. A dying parent. A woman stitching by low flame. These were quiet lights. Small. Private. They did not speak, but they said everything. Someone was still awake. Someone was still living. The town breathed differently at night. Slower. But never stopped. Even as most dreamed, others walked. Worked. Worried. It was a world within a world. overlooked, but constant, the night shift of survival, the hidden rhythm of the restless town. So while you may have slept fitfully, under scratchy wool, listening to creaking beams and distant bells, others did not. The medieval town never slept. It only turned its face away. And in the dimness, it whispered and waited. In a medieval town, law didn't sleep just because the sun went down. If anything, it became more alert, more suspicious. Because when the streets darkened, and shutters closed, and whispers replaced conversation, all kinds of things began to move. Quiet things. Dangerous things. And so the laws of night were not the same as the laws of day. They were stricter, sharper, more paranoid. Curfews were not merely suggestions. They were commands. At a certain hour, depending on the town, the season, or the mood of the local lord, a bell would toll. Loud, long, unmistakable. That was your warning. Time to be indoors. Time to put out the fires. Time to shut up, literally and figuratively. You were not expected to be on the streets after that bell rang. The word, curfew, comes from the old French couvre-feu, cover the fire. It meant extinguishing flames to prevent nighttime disasters. But it also meant controlling movement. A town couldn't be trusted in darkness. Neither could its people. After curfew, if you were seen outside, you were immediately suspect. A thief. A plotter. A spy. Or worse. Watchmen enforced the curfew. They weren't police as we know them. Not professionally trained. Often just strong-backed townsfolk with clubs, lanterns, and sharp eyes. They walked the same narrow routes night after night, calling out the hours, listening for cries, and watching for anyone who shouldn't be there. If they saw you after hours, they could question you, arrest you, or simply club you to the ground. Some towns required you to carry a light at night, a candle, a lantern. If you were caught walking without one, you could be fined, or accused of planning to rob someone. Because only criminals liked the dark. Everyone else had something to show. A face. A name. A reason to be out. But crime still thrived. Because darkness offers protection that no guard can penetrate. Thieves waited for curfew to begin. Then crept from attics. From alleys. From holes dug beneath floorboards. They broke locks. Stole chickens. Took coins hidden under hearthstones. They vanished into the black just as quickly. Not all criminals were silent. Some were violent. Fights broke out in the dark. Over stolen food. Over insults. Over nothing. Blood dried quickly on cobblestones, blending into the filth. And if a scream echoed at midnight, most people didn't look. They prayed. They locked the door. They waited for silence again. Justice moved slowly. Unless it was angry. If a thief was caught red-handed, there might be no trial. Just a rope. A beam. A crowd. Hangings happened at dawn. But they were arranged at night. Decided by torchlight. Sometimes without records. Sometimes without mercy. And not all crimes were theft. Being a stranger was enough. Foreigners out at night were viewed with deep suspicion. Especially if they spoke little of the local tongue. Accents became evidence. Tattered clothes were signs of intent. Poverty was mistaken for guilt. The laws themselves were not written for clarity. They were loose. Subject to interpretation. Often based on custom. On rumor. On who you were. And who you weren't. The mayor's son might get a warning. A beggar's son might lose a hand. That was justice, unbalanced, candlelit, and afraid. Torches, too, cast lies. They made familiar faces look monstrous. They turned shadows into threats. The line between safety and accusation could blur in an instant. A wrong step, a wrong answer, and you might find yourself shackled in the town square come morning. Eyes swollen. Accused of something you never did. Because night did not care for truth. only for silence and order. People learned to fear certain streets, certain doors. Whispers traveled faster than lantern light. Stories of past crimes clung to corners like cobwebs. Don't walk that way after curfew. Don't speak to the man with one glove. Don't answer knocks that come too softly. The night had its own language. Not of words, but of rules. Of what to avoid. When to hide. When to run. Candlelight was fragile. The law even more so. And under their flickering shadows, everyone became both hunter and hunted. So you stayed in. You drew the curtains. You barred the door. You whispered prayers to saints and hoped the night passed quietly. Because when crime met curfew, there was no peace, only silence. Dawn didn't arrive quietly in a medieval town. It arrived with a shuffle. A thud. A sneeze. It arrived with the creak of doors. The clatter of hooves. The groan of wood on stone. The hiss of stale breath in cold air. There was no waking up, as we understand it now. No warm cup of coffee. No gentle stretch beneath soft blankets. There was a market to open. And it waited for no one. As the first weak light touched the thatched rooftops, the day's oldest rhythms stirred again. Carts pulled by donkeys or horses groaned into the town square. Some came from nearby villages. Others had been waiting outside the town gates all night, too poor or too common to be allowed inside after dark. Now they rattled over stones slick with yesterday's waste, positioning themselves in the same places their grandfathers once stood. Every market spot was known, claimed, fought over, if necessary. Vendors began to unload their lives. Baskets of bruised apples. Barrels of fish packed in browning straw. Cuts of meat still steaming in the morning cold. Wheels of cheese wrapped in cloth. Smells mixed into a strange bouquet, sour, sweet, sharp, and always slightly spoiled. Children rubbed their eyes and stared. Chickens fluttered in cages. A goat cried. Someone tripped over a rope. In the end, entertainment was not separate from life. It was woven into the everyday grind. A distraction. A break. A performance of resilience. To sing, to joke, to laugh loudly in a world filled with disease, filth, fear, and labor, that was survival. The noise wasn't just amusement. It was a shield. A defense against the silence that might remind you of how fragile it all was. And so the town rang. From dawn to dusk. From birth to death. The noise never stopped. Because if it did, people might have to listen, to the wind, to the sickness, to the rats, to the crack in the wall, to the emptiness. And that, perhaps, was the scariest sound of all. There were rare moments, strange, still moments, when the medieval town went quiet. Not just quiet in the way a room goes silent after a joke fails. Not just quiet in the hush of early dawn, with distant roosters and soft footsteps. But a deeper, heavier silence. As if something had stopped moving. As if the town itself was holding its breath. It didn't happen often. The towns were built on noise, stacked layer upon layer, cobblers hammering, children squealing, carts squeaking, drunks shouting, dogs barking, town criers declaring, vendors singing their deals like desperate birds. Noise was the heartbeat. But silence crept in sometimes. And when it did, it unsettled everyone. Because silence wasn't peace. It was a warning. Or a signal. Sometimes, the silence came after a bell. Not the hourly bell. Not the cheerful clang of the marketplace, or the church calling to mass. But the slow, solemn toll, that meant something had gone wrong. A death. A fire. Or worse, the approach of plague. At that sound, people paused mid-step. Conversations stopped. Hands froze over baskets. The air grew thick, not from smoke or rot, but from fear. The plague silenced towns like nothing else could. One day, the streets would be filled with noise and trade and jokes and shouting. The next, just whispers. Or nothing. Doors stayed shut. Windows shuttered. No carts rolled through the squares. No bells rang. The market did not open, because the sellers were dead, or dying, or praying. Silence also followed executions. After the crowd had cheered or jeered, after the rope had tightened, after the condemned had stopped moving, the people would leave slowly, feet dragging. The noise they carried with them would fade, and the square would echo with absence. Birds might land near the gallows. A dog might sniff at the stains. But there was no music, no laughter, just the soft sound of wind over stone. Storms brought silence too. Not during the storm, those were noisy, violent affairs. But before that eerie calm, when even the animals went quiet, when the air pressed against your skin, when your ears rang not with bells or shouting, but with nothing, that kind of silence made people nervous. Old women muttered charms. Children were pulled inside. Men checked the roof beams and said things under their breath. Sometimes silence was holy. In the church, especially during prayer, the priest's voice would stop. Heads would bow. Candles flickered. And for just a few moments, the great, groaning machine of the town paused. It was a fragile moment. A rare one. But it could be felt. A kind of quiet awe. Or relief. Until someone coughed. Or a baby cried. Or a bench creaked. And the spell broke. Night brought something like silence, but not quite. There were fewer voices. Fewer feet. But the town still groaned and muttered in its sleep. Boards creaked. Wind howled through cracks. Rats scratched. Dogs barked at nothing. And if you listened long enough, you always heard something. The silence of night was never pure. It was always haunted. But true silence, the kind that made even the most hardened townsfolk pause, only came with loss. After fire. After war. After plague. When too many stalls were empty. Too many doors stayed closed. Too many names were no longer spoken. Then the town fell quiet. And that quiet settled into the stones. Into the beams. Into the spaces between people who still lived there. You could feel that kind of silence. Taste it. It hung in the air like wood smoke or mold. People moved slower. Talked less. Prayed more. They waited for the noise to return. Not because they missed it, but because it meant life. Eventually, it always did. A child would laugh again. A merchant would shout. A hammer would fall. The market would reopen. Life, noisy and filthy and restless, would resume its rhythm. The silence would fade into memory, pushed away by the sounds of people trying to survive another day. Because the medieval town did not love silence. It feared it. It resisted it. With drums. With bells. With jokes. With prayer. And with the stubborn, endless noise of human life. And so, in the end, when the town was finally quiet, it didn't mean peace. It meant something had gone missing. Something had ended. Or someone had. And all you could do was wait for the wheel to turn, the noise to return, and for life to stumble forward once more. In the winding, unpaved streets of medieval towns, life throbbed with a chaotic rhythm that never seemed to pause, not for night, not for illness, not even for the quiet dignity of death. These towns were not idyllic villages of whispered prayers and peaceful candlelit nights. They were living, breathing entities of constant movement, where dirt clung to every surface, sound bounced endlessly off timber walls, and rest was a luxury few could afford. People packed themselves into these dense, uneven clusters of homes, markets, workshops, and alleys, bringing with them all the noise and filth of their everyday lives. From the moment the sun peeked over a horizon shrouded in smoke and chimney soot, the town awakened not with a yawn, but with a cough, a slam, a clang, a shout, and it only grew louder and messier from there. The town's architecture itself contributed to the madness. Buildings leaned against one another as if exhausted, their upper stories jetting into the narrow streets below, blocking sunlight and trapping smells. Gutters, if they existed, often served more as pathways for chamber pot contents than clean rainwater. Floors were uneven, walls were thin, and nothing truly kept out the noise. Inside a home, you heard your neighbor argue with her husband. You heard the blacksmith's hammer. You heard the pig someone kept indoors squealing beneath the floorboards. There was no true boundary between private and public space, and with that collapse came the erosion of silence. The homes were crowded, frequently shared by multiple families, apprentices, boarders, animals, and vermin alike. Cleanliness was both a daily challenge and a philosophical debate. When water was scarce, baths were rare, and soap was expensive. How clean was clean enough? Even the morning air, instead of freshness, greeted townsfolk with the heavy scent of ash, rot dung, and humanity. Markets opened early and closed late, each stall a miniature theater of trade, noise, and colorful insult. Vendors bellowed their wares over one another in an endless game of volume and spectacle. Bakers competed with fishmongers, who argued with butchers, who snarled at cheesemakers. Chickens flat loose in the dust, dogs snapped at one another's tails, and barefoot children darted through the maze of activity, adding their own chorus of shrieks and laughter. Coins clinked, barrels thudded open. Someone somewhere was always shouting about prices, about dishonor, about a stolen goat, or just for the joy of being heard. Noise wasn't a byproduct of town life, it was the town's pulse. And it wasn't just the people. Animals were everywhere, contributing their own symphony of unpleasantness. Geese hissed, cows groaned, donkeys brayed at all hours, cats yowled in mating rituals from the rooftops, dogs barked through the night, either at shadows or at each other. Rats gnawed behind walls, and horses clattered down cobblestone streets dragging carts filled with produce, sewage barrels, or corpses. Depending on the day, these creatures weren't confined to stables. They were part of everyday life, wandering in and out of homes, drinking from buckets, lying in the street, or dying in corners where no one bothered to move them until they truly began to stink. Towns weren't designed for sanitation. They were designed for access, control, and containment of people, of taxes, and of trade. Waste was thrown into the street, where it mixed with straw and trampled food and rain and blood. And where the filth settled, flies followed. And where flies went, disease was never far behind. Despite this, or perhaps because of it, medieval towns never truly slept. They rested, at best. Even under the cover of darkness, life pressed on. After the evening bell tolled the curfew, a law designed to cover the fire and end the day, there were still footsteps on the cobblestones. Watchmen prowled with lanterns, barking orders and demanding explanations. Thieves and lovers slipped through back alleys. Cats hunted rats in silence. Somewhere, a woman cried quietly into her sleeve while the town, for the most part, pretended not to hear. And if you were caught outside without a lantern or a reason, you risked being mistaken for a criminal, or worse, treated like one. The night was for secrets. It was when things happened that no one wanted recorded. Murders, affairs, escapes, punishments, deals. The absence of sunlight didn't bring calm, it brought uncertainty, suspicion, and the real possibility of vanishing. Yet despite this chaos, people found ways to survive. They adapted to the noise because they had to. Entertainment, like everything else in a medieval town, was shared, public, and usually loud. There were no quiet concerts or solitary hobbies. A juggler might erupt into a square unannounced, drumming and shouting to attract a crowd. Traveling musicians carried fiddles and flutes and lutes, blasting love songs or religious ballads to an audience half listening while buying vegetables. Storytellers used booming voices and wild gestures. Puppet shows were filled with smacks, shrieks, and rude jokes. Religious plays rolled through town on wagons, retelling biblical tales in booming voices, with costumes of wool and straw and papier-mâché masks. Festivals were louder still, drums, bells, dancing, shouting, and laughter, all blending into a glorious mess of color and chaos. Noise was not just entertainment, it was community. It was relief from toil. It was a reason to stop and smile and feel something other than fatigue. But not all noise was joyful. Punishment in medieval towns was public and loud by design. Stocks creaked under the weight of prisoners. Whips cracked. The condemned were marched through streets while crowds jeered. Executions were announcements as much as they were justice. Hanging bells rang early in the morning. Crowds formed before breakfast. Children sat on shoulders. Merchants packed up shop to witness the spectacle. A man's last words had to be shouted to be heard. His screams, if he gave any, became part of the town's memory. And when the event was over, the silence that followed was chilling, brief, but heavy. The crowd dispersed, the noise returned, but for a moment, the absence of sound told more truth than the words had. And then there were the markets at dawn. After the terrible hush of night, the early morning buzzed with renewed desperation. Before the sun rose fully, carts arrived at the town gates. Farmers, fishers, butchers, and weavers prepared for another day of yelling, bartering, arguing, and haggling. Bread, stiff from yesterday's oven, eels still wriggling in wet baskets, spoons, rope, onions, wool, all for sale, all under the watchful eyes of guards and competitors alike. Buyers came early, knowing the best goods would disappear by noon, and so the town shook itself awake, not gently, but all at once, loudly, clumsily, and with the familiar chaos of survival. It was not beautiful, but it was alive. In a place so full of people, everything public was intimate. Your business was everyone's business. News traveled faster than rats. A neighbor's illness, a blacksmith's drunken brawl, the baker's daughter's pregnancy. It was all discussed loudly and without shame. Privacy was nearly impossible. People slept in shared beds, bathed in public bathhouses, when they existed, prayed together, ate together, fought together. They yelled across fences and windows and wells. The town's breath was one breath, its voice, one jumbled, ever-changing song. And its silence, when it came, meant something had gone terribly wrong. There were times, of course, when the town did go quiet, not for sleep, but for fear. When plague arrived, the sound drained out of life, like blood from a wound. Suddenly, the noise stopped. The markets emptied. The bells stopped ringing. No preachers, no fools, no music, just the shuffle of feet carrying bodies, just the squeak of wheels on wooden coffins, just prayers, whispered from behind locked doors. Those moments of silence did not comfort, they terrified, because silence in the medieval town meant death had taken hold. It meant something larger than noise had come, something that didn't need to shout to be felt. Eventually, the town recovered. It always did. People returned to the markets. The shouting resumed. New jokes replaced old grief. Life returned because it had to. The town could not survive in silence. It was built on noise, on the clatter and bellow of people refusing to disappear. And so the wheel kept turning. The bells rang again. The children laughed again. A peddler shouted about his turnips. A woman accused a neighbor of theft. A juggler returned. The rats came back. The dogs barked. And that, in the end, was the truth of medieval towns. They were not places of silence or peace or stillness. They were alive with grit, with stink, with laughter, with filth. They were never quiet, because quietness meant something was broken. They never slept, because there was always more to do. And they never stayed still, because survival in that world meant motion, sound, and endurance. The noise was part of the breathing, it was part of the prayer, and it was part of the sleep. Even now, if you close your eyes and drift into a dream of cobblestones and wooden beams and flickering torchlight, you might hear it again, that strange, muddy, bustling heartbeat of a medieval town that never stopped trying, never stopped shouting, and never truly rested.